Hi, I'm Christof Bernau, and we are at the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems farm here at UCSC, and we're in our blueberry plot. Today we wanted to look at a few different things. I want to talk briefly about sort of the general architecture and growth habit of blueberry plants. And then we're going to look specifically at the individual stems or canes and think about their age and what that means in relation to pruning and productivity. We'll take a quick peek at individual fruit buds and flower buds, and then we're going to do a little bit of pruning and go from start to finish on at least one of these plants here. First of all, blueberries are a long live perennial plant, and they for the most part have a upright or somewhat upright architecture, which you can see sort of from this plant. This is fairly characteristic. If you look around the plot like some of these other ones over here, you can see a little shorter, squattier plants, and then these ones are also retaining their leaves, whereas the first plants we looked at here, these have really dropped all but a handful of leaves from last season, and when they fully break out of dormancy, we'll get a new crop of leaves for this season. That difference is really just a representation of varietal difference in how those varieties are interacting with the environment, their phenotypic response to the environment. For the most part, fairly upright plants. And then if you look here, you'll see at the base of the plant, they are very much a multi-stemmed plant. Not all blueberries express themselves identically, but this is fairly typical of what you'll see in a lot of well-established plants. We prune every single year, but these canes will be left to grow and develop for roughly a 5 to 6 year period. If we get down inside of this plant, we've got some slender canes like this one here, which may be a little bit hard to see, but it's just a single stem. Here, I'll actually sacrifice one of these. We have a single stem that just barely began to branch that grew up last season from the base of the plant. So this would be only a 1 year stem. And then if I get a little further in here, I've got a stem like this one, which I guess I will also sacrifice, that has done some branching. In the first year of development, this cane grows up purely vegetatively, no fruit, just foliage. In the second year of development, or let me actually back up, by the end of that first year of development, you might start to see a little bit of lateral branching, but what you will see for certain is the development of new fruit buds that basically happen at the terminal portions, out towards the very end of the stems. Going into year 2, this stem is going to give us flowers where we see fruit buds at this point in time. And then those flowers, if well pollinated, will translate into fruit that we can harvest and eat or sell. So that first year cane in its second year starts to give us fruit. And then going into its third year, it's going to end up looking something like this, where I've got more lateral branches developing. And those lateral branches are going to then give us more and more fruit because we get this kind of terminal or near terminal development of the fruit buds. And then so if we move down the sort of the age spectrum a little bit, stem like this one here, this is probably a 3 or a 4 year old cane, probably only 3 years old. And I've got that much more fruit potential on that cane. But I'm going to jump forward a little bit here, but as we get to this point here, this one here with multiple branching, kind of a change in color of the bark from kind of this cinnamony brownish red to kind of more of a gray bark. And those color changes aren't consistent across all varieties, but in this case, you start to see this color change. This cane is starting to get kind of full and crowded and dense, but it is still very productive. But after this season, this one's probably going to get removed in this plant. And then this one here, one of the older canes, this one's also going to get removed. Why do we want to remove those big canes that are so big and productive? The reality of it is that they decline in productivity after 5 or 6 years of growth, you'll start to see less initiation of new lateral branches, less development of fruit buds. And so even though this is kind of at its peak now, they make a somewhat rapid transition in sort of declining yields. The way we think about pruning is kind of this continuous regeneration cycle. Each year, we're removing about 20% of the total growth, and that is mostly focused on the older growth that was at its peak and is now starting to decline. And then in doing so, we're opening up the canopy, we're making space for new canes to be developing, and they won't be as productive as this one is at first, but they're in a progression, they're in a succession on their way towards kind of taking on the same role and sort of the same degree of productivity that we have here. So we'll go through that process each year, kind of selecting out the oldest canes. The other things that we're going to do in here is we're also going to evaluate and look like, oh, okay, is there really any like really brushy, twiggy, weak growth that isn't contributing much to the plants, either in terms of fruitfulness or in terms of photosynthesis that strengthens the whole plant. If we have some portions of the plant that are just not contributing as much in that regard, we're going to typically prune those out and remove those as well so that the plant can focus its energy and its resources on the stronger portions of the overall canopy. The other thing I wanted to show you though too is a look at the different bud types that we have here. So before we get into the actual pruning process, what I want to just show you is to try to highlight kind of key parts of the plants here. If we take a look at this stem here, along this stem, you can almost see these kind of real slender, pointy buds that are here. Those are all leaf buds. Those, when they break out of dormancy, when they start to express themselves, we're going to get leaves on each of those points along the stem. And those can be all over the plant, and they can even be close to the ends of the plants, but they're especially present lower down. When we get up towards the tips of the stems, the terminal portions, whether that's an individual one-year-old stem or something that is more branched like both of these, you'll see that there are these really fat, and these are already breaking out of dormancy, so they're kind of extra large, but there are these really fat buds that I kind of think of them as almost sort of like pine cone shaped, but each of these will translate into a cluster of flowers, which, if we get good pollination, will then translate into a cluster of fruit. Being able to recognize the difference between those two is an important part of the process as you're thinking about how's the health of this plant look, how much yield am I going to get out of this plant, what can I actually expect from this plant? So let me just jump into a little bit of pruning here. When I look at a plant, first thing I'm going to do is like, how's the vigor overall? How crowded? How dense is it? And who are the big cuts that I want to make first? And you know, it could be this one here. It could be back over here, this oldest cane here. They're both still looking pretty productive. This one does have a bunch of dead wood in it though. And earlier I said, oh, you know, we might prune this next year. But now as I look a little bit more closely at this, I think this is going to be a stem that I'm going to remove. So I did, in fact, just sacrifice a whole bunch of fruit. And you might think, oh, wow, you don't want to do that. But, you know, with a lot of plants, when we're thinking about growing them, apples, peaches, and whatnot, one of the things that we do after we get fruit set is we actually thin the fruit in the case so that the plant can concentrate its energy on a smaller number of fruits and produce higher quality fruit. Somewhat the same is true with blueberries in that they can carry a lot of fruit, but if there's too much fruit, you will end up with a lot of small fruit. And if we slightly reduce the yield, we will increase the size of that fruit. So in here, I'm going to take that one older cane out, and then I'm going to take one more older cane out, and then that's kind of my 20% there. And then I'm going to come back and start looking, do I see any really small twiggy stuff that I want to remove? that's not looking real promising. I don't see too much of that. I see a couple stems here and there. So then I start to work my way up the canopy after I've kind of thought about and assessed and acted upon the bottom. Then I'm going to start looking at individual stems and say, okay, here's a lateral that already bore fruit at this terminal portion. This part right here is spent and dead. Nothing's going to come of that. But immediately behind where I made that pruning cut, there is still fruitfulness, so I want to keep some of that. But it's also a little crowded, so then I might do a little bit of thinning of some individual laterals just to make space, just so I get good air circulation throughout the canopy, so that I get good sunlight infiltration throughout the canopy. So start to finish, there's a little bit of a difference here, but there's not a really dramatic difference. And I could, in a minute or two here, I could call this good and say I'm done. Or I could probably spend another half an hour going through and being, oh, little one here, little one here, little one here. And if I'm at home and I've got, 5 or 10 plants at home and I have the day, great, I'm going to spend a lot of time. If I'm working on a larger scale and I'm trying to move through a big block of plants, we're going to prioritize. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into life cycle and management and pruning specifically on blueberries, and gives you some perspective on how you think about prioritizing your time and how much time you might or might not spend with each individual plant. You could be super detailed and comb through everything, or you can take a little bit more broad brush approach and focus on the big critical cuts and not invest much time in the small cuts. And in both cases, you'll have great results.